Welcome to the last of this week's three lectures in which we're exploring the archaeology of disease, particularly the archaeology of contemporary disease. In my last lecture, we looked at how the impact of COVID has affected the materiality of our lives, looking at everything from landscapes to buildings to personal items. And for this final lecture, I want to home in on one very specific piece of material culture, the face mask. Now, for lots of us, we probably hadn't worn a face mask, or certainly hardly worn a face mask, until really the last 6 or 8 months. But suddenly these things have become something we're always concerned with. Have we got one in our pocket? Can you remember where we put it? Going out to the shops, getting halfway and realizing we didn't have our masks. So these little, scrappy little bits of fabric or paper have suddenly become really important in our lives. So it's important to if you could step back and think about how most of us would have first encountered the face mask since the arrival of COVID. And initially, when they first started being widely used, most of us were using these kind of things, these simple folded paper, kind of glued together with simple elastic ear straps. They are, when you look at something like this, they are absolutely and completely functional. They are incredibly mundane, they're disposable. They're the kind of things we hardly give much thought to. But what I want to do in this lecture is just think a little bit about actually how we already had an existing discourse and debate about masks and face coverings in our own society, and think about how the COVID face mask has been adopted and co-opted by a lot of these debates, by a lot of these wider streams within our contemporary society. And think about their life course and their ultimate disposal. All things which we do as archaeologists with older material culture. And again, it's your regular reminder that we can take those same kinds of framings and apply them to the material we look at related to our modern lives. So if you go back to the early 20th century, there, of course, have been other phases of life where people have been strongly encouraged to wear face masks for what we might broadly call health and safety reasons. So if we go back to the great Asian flu crisis of Spanish flu of 1919, which led to a huge amount of mortality, people then, as now, were strongly encouraged to wear face masks. Back then, as far as the pictures seem to indicate, the face masks are largely fabric rather than paper. But these things were seen as important prophylactics preventing spread of disease in exactly the same way as they are today, because Spanish flu, just like COVID, is something spread through droplets absorbed through the respiratory system. So a mask does have a measurable effect. But once the Spanish flu had disappeared, face mask wearing, certainly in Europe, largely disappeared again. It's not until we get into World War II, and once again the idea of wearing a mask to cover your face for health reasons becomes really important. And this is obviously connected to the threat of poison gas. Of course, ironically, there was very little use of gas in this way during World War II, particularly on civilian populations, but it was anticipated it would cause a serious threat. So rather than an equipment just being supplied to the military, civilian populations were all provided with gas masks in the run-up to World War II and throughout World War II. There are different sized gas masks for adults and children. People were encouraged by law or were compelled by law to take gas masks with them. They became part of the new set of material culture used by civilian populations and military populations during the war. And along with it went a set of posters and leaflets and advertising emphasizing the importance of carrying the gas mask and looking after the gas mask. So in many ways, we saw the same kind of attitude towards face coverings during the war as we do today. Although, of course, during the war, this was precautionary. The gas masks were carried. They were rarely ever actually worn. Another way in which we see masks taking on a life of their own is as we move into the more recent past, the role of the mask, particularly in protest. A lot of you will be familiar with this mask. This is the Guy Fawkes mask, as in its particular iteration, connected to the film V for Vendetta, which came out in the 1990s. Here in this film, it's set in a dystopian future involving a renegade rebel trying to topple an authoritarian regime. And using the model of Guy Fawkes for his costume and physical appearance. Now, of course, the idea of burning a guy and decorating a guy with a paper mask is something which has a long antiquity in a particularly British context. But the important thing about V for Vendetta is it's taken a specifically British cultural reference point and made it global. And crucially, what was originally an artistic design for a creative work of fictional filmmaking made a leap out into popular culture. The use of these V for Vendetta masks has become widely used in protests against a variety of different political and social organisations. It's initially adopted by the group Anonymous in its protests against the Scientology church, but has become more widely used. And rather ironically, for pieces of material culture which are avowedly anti-authoritarian and often anti-capitalist, you can buy these things quite easily on things like Amazon. So you have a kind of inherent contradiction in this kind of thing, where these things are used as shorthands for protest against, I suppose, broadly speaking, neoliberalism, whilst equally being produced on mass scales in factories in places like China. Another area where we see the adoption of a face mask in popular culture, some of us might remember, is if you go back to the rave culture of the 1990s. Again, here we see use of the face mask and along with bodysuits, NBC suits, quite widely adopted in the rave scene, particularly the DJ duo Alternate, who made them part of their look. But these face masks were particularly adopted by people out at raves, decorating them, providing a sense of anonymity. Embedded in a musical scene that was actually very anti-authoritarian. Again, a lot of the actual venues were illegal raves taking place in abandoned buildings. So again, this is a scene with a very strong anti-authoritarian streak. It became very politicized as the Conservative administration at the time clamped down on this kind of musical events. And again, we see that connection of wearing the face mask, covering the mask, with a sense of active opposition to centralized state. More widely, recently in popular culture, the gas mask and the face mask is adopted in a variety of contexts. Obviously, we see it in a lot of science fiction. So, of course, our favourite baddie, Darth Vader and Kylo Ren, they all wear face masks, gas masks. We see it in Doctor Who with the use of the face mask in a number of Doctor Who episodes, and it's become the pimped up gas mask has become a standard of steampunk couture. So the face mask has become something which has a lot of cultural and political resonances. More recently, for a lot of us, until COVID, our main experience day to day, particularly in a university town, with seeing a face mask, was face masks being worn by students from Taiwan, Korea, and Hong Kong, so broadly East Asia, where in places like China, particularly due to pollution, but for other social reasons as well, wearing the face mask was much more common. And I think for a lot of us in the UK, we became quite familiar with the sight of Chinese students wearing face masks, which for us, we often, I think a lot of people found that unusual, something distinctly noticeable. But this primarily grew out of a concern for pollution rather than particularly a concern for spreading disease. But I think there's always an element of that. And for most of us, until well into last year, when our only experience of seeing this kind of face mask in the street would have been in the context of Asian students. Now, what's interesting is the face mask became very politicized towards the back end of last year, as face masks were adopted by the Hong Kong protesters. There's been a great deal of social disruption in Hong Kong over the last year, and the use of the face mask as a conscious decision to indicate opposition to Chinese administration became increasingly widespread. It was there already within the culture, but it was deliberately used and also ultimately legislated against by protesters. And again, this is a really interesting exercise where we see the global impact of that, because the places like university towns where you had large communities of Chinese and Hong Kong students, the same kind of politicization of material culture in the form of masks that was seen on the streets of Hong Kong also became politicized within the context of university campuses. So I'm not sure how many of us remember getting this email, but we got this email around last year talking about how university students within our own institution were wearing masks and helmets on campus as a sense of as a way of indicating political support and political affiliation for the Hong Kong protesters. And also there's a very clear sense that these were aimed not just these were aimed at people who were opposed to the protests within our own community. And the university found itself having to make decisions about how face mask wearing and protective gear wearing was going to be managed and dealt with in terms of campus security. Another way in which face masks or face coverings, of course, have also been politicised is in the issue of wearing the burqa. The burqa, along with the niqab, are one of the two types of head coverings worn by some Muslim women, which partially or entirely cover the face. Now, this again is a fantastic example of how a specific element of dress has become politicized. You'll remember the political fallout of Boris Johnson's journalism about the burqa, talking about characterizing it as looking at someone looking out of a postbox, and this became a highly controversial issue within the context of Britain. And interestingly, a lot of the debate was framed around perceived issues of women's rights and women's agency within the Muslim community, often coming from political groupings within wider contemporary politics, who otherwise generally showed relatively little interest in issues of women's rights. Whilst it's very controversial in Britain, it's even more controversial in many countries abroad. And whilst in Britain it's been a political issue, there's been no legislation against wearing of the burqa or the niqab. Unlike, for example, particularly in France, which has a very strong anti-clerical tradition, which partly framed a lot of the debate about wearing of the face mask. But again, the wider contemporary resonances about the way in which Muslims dress in public is much more contentious. I think it's probably fair to say in France there's an element of very strong tradition very strong tradition of secularism. But also there is a lot of other complex political issues going on there. But as well as France completely banning it, there are a number of other European countries where those face coverings are either completely or partially banned. So this is a great example of how covering the face becomes politicized, and the politics is not just about issues about left or right, it's about issues to do with secularism. And also, I think implicitly in a lot of this, these debates are strongly gendered. A final way in which kind of face masks are, or face coverings are, something we thought about before the advent of COVID is actually motorcycle helmets. One of the big changes we now have when going to pay for petrol or going into a bank is, a year ago we was actually specifically and actively told not to cover our faces when going into a garage or going into a bank, because there's a sense that we might be a potential armed robber, whereas now it's quite the opposite, and we're finding ourselves regularly in these counterintuitive situations where we go into spaces where previously the emphasis was on revealing the face, and suddenly we are being told to cover the face. And interestingly, even before this, there was a strong pressure by a lot of motorcycle groups, motorbike groups, to allow them to be allowed to wear helmets going in to pay for petrol. And what's quite interesting is when there were protests against this, a very specific parallel was drawn, or contrast was drawn, between wearing helmets and wearing burqas. So again, there's this interesting intersection between different discourses about covering the face already swirling around in our culture, even before the face mask arrives. Now, of course, once we have the advent of COVID earlier on this year, suddenly we are all in a world where people are being expected to wear face masks some or all of the time when outside. And obviously, the precise rules have been varying over time, and it keys into a wide variety of other strategies and techniques we've had to use to prevent the spread of disease, including social things like wider social distancing. And again, for most of us, when we started wearing masks, this is the kind of mask we were wearing. We were wearing those simple paper masks, because those are frankly the only ones which were available. If you went into garages, went into shops, it was the simple paper mask which was most accessible. And we've all become familiar with the different types of paper mask. And it's these simple paper ones, the ones we still see worn most widely. That, as you can see from this picture, the notion of what constitutes wearing a mask and the issue of having the nose out, which kind of defeats the purpose of wearing a mask, is something which has been an issue all the way through. And this kind of half-mast wearing of the mask is a quite interesting decision. It's people who don't want the discomfort of wearing a mask, but equally feel the social pressure to have something on their faces. What I found particularly interesting is how wearing the mask impacts onto all sorts of subtle aspects of human behaviour. So, for example, I've personally found it really noticeable that when out and about, when in public, you suddenly realise how many gestures and how much social communication goes on with just the face. Now, it's obviously axiomatic that we use our faces all the time to make social markers, to make social signals to other people, whether it's mouthing the word thanks when someone lets you in through the door, a grin, an apologetic smile if you nearly bump into somebody. These are all things which are covered up by the face mask. And I know people say, but when you smile, you use your eyes. Well, that's actually not always true. When you're doing a genuine smile because you're genuinely happy, you smile with your eyes. But often, if you're making little social signals, little social indicators, it's just a quick grimace, just to indicate assent or apology. So instead, we start using our bodies and our hands much more. Hand signals, hand gestures become much more extravagant. So we're actually covering our faces changes how we use our body more widely. And I think that's something people haven't really been talking about particularly. Of course, inevitably, also as masks become more embedded in society, we start to see the mask being used as a way of indicating social identity, a way of expressing personality, and of course, equally, it becomes something which is embedded in a system of production. So after the initial spread of functional paper masks, we've now seen the spread of masks, cheap, cheerful masks, all sorts of different patterns, all sorts of different decorations, all sorts of different designs, with that sense, as with any other aspect of clothing or personal adornment, it's a way of sending messages, it's a way of expressing who we are. And interestingly, it has gone from being something which is seen as fundamentally a medical, surgical health thing to become something through which we express broader personality. What's also been particularly interesting is how this has cascaded through all aspects of society. So whilst for most of us, the paper masks or fabric masks we use are maybe homemade or relatively cheap ones, as a element of costume, masks have been adopted as part of haute couture. So we're seeing celebrities being depicted in masks. High-end fashion houses, your Gucci's, are creating their own range of exceptionally high-end and, of course, exceptionally expensive face masks. So all the ways in which clothes and fashion are used to express identity and make messages about power and money, which normal clothes are implicated in. The face mask has become part of that. It's become brought into wider debates and wider discourses about costume and appearance. We also see different national traditions and national iterations of it. Places like East Asia, where they have a much longer tradition of wearing face masks, they haven't been wearing the paper face masks in the same way we do because they already had a tradition. But also we're seeing interesting things where local national traditions are taking face masks, reworking them in their own idioms. So here we see this is Mongolia. Now this is obviously people in highly elaborate national dress. This isn't the kind of thing people are normally wearing on the streets of Ulaanbaatar, but they have taken, these are people wearing Mongolian national costume, and they have incorporated a very new element of appearance, the face mask, in using symbolisms and idiom which key into long-term traditional ways of appearing. So we have traditional Mongolian folk costumes combined with a Mongolian, very distinctly Mongolian folk style face masks. There's some really interesting things going on there. Also, we've seen the face mask has become a shorthand for a large number of wider issues about things we have to do to mitigate against the spread of COVID. So here we see in Brazil, of course, somewhere where the whole issue of COVID has been incredibly politically contentious, with Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, being very, very anti-COVID in the sense of minimizing its effects. Here we see the statue of Christ in Rio de Janeiro with a face mask projected onto it and the big sign saying masks save. And again, there's some really interesting juxtaposition of notions of Christian salvation and mental health and physical health salvation on a highly iconic and internationally recognised item. And what's interesting is we've seen the wearing of masks by people. We've seen the use and the secondary placement of masks in all sorts of different social contexts. So we've seen them being put on all sorts of statues. The internet's awash with pictures of bits of public art with shown wearing face masks. And so essentially we're seeing something, an element of subversion, an element of humour, an element of creativity going into the use of face masks. They're being extended. also they're actually doing something to the monuments themselves. They're reminding us that actually monuments like this, once they're initially put up, that's not the end of their lives, and they're things which are continually interacted with by the public. But of course, the mask has also become the focus of something much more contentious for a lot of people, particularly in certain political traditions. The mask is seen not as something which will save people and which will protect them. For many people, there's a strong sense that the mask is a symbol of oppression. So whether we see people like Peter Hitchens, a columnist in the Daily Mail, trying to frame it as a muzzle rather than the mask, whether we see it particularly on elements of the alt-right, seeing it as a symbol of tyranny. There's some really interesting and contentious ways in which a relatively functional object is being adopted and has accreted a strong sense of political importance. And what's also interesting is we're seeing a blurring of a lot of traditional barriers and dividing lines between different political traditions, centred and homing in around COVID. More generally, masks have been drawn into this debate. So, for example, with the anti-COVID broader anti-COVID movement, brings in issues of being against the big state, which is particularly associated with the right, but also with opposition to things like vaccination, a big pharma, and the industrial medical complex, which broadly speaking is a position more widely held by some elements of the New Age and broadly speaking left and green movements. So we're seeing a blurring of traditions. We're seeing also the central role of the body as a part of that debate, how a lot of it is homing in around the perceived control of external organisations over the body. So we're seeing some interesting flipping of arguments. For example, abortion has traditionally been seen as a debate about who controls the body and who has the right to control the body, with people who are pro-choice arguing that they should not be told how to control their body by exterior organisations, whereas actually that notion of bodily control is now being flipped by people who are on the right, a political position which is traditionally, certainly within some traditions, the right as being anti-abortion, now arguing about the importance of bodily independence and autonomy. We've seen particularly the role of masks has become, obviously in recent months, became particularly focused in an American context where people like Donald Trump were really activated the role of the mask as a very distinct political marker. He was very, very, very slow to use the mask. He attacked opposition for wearing the mask. Of course, finally, the pressure was put on him to start wearing the mask, and then he, in a typical Trumpite way, he kind of flips it and starts talking about wearing the mask as something patriotic. But we have within this, hopefully, we're starting to see the mask captures a lot of paradoxes we have about wearing and covering the face. So, for example, in France, you have a situation where a Muslim woman can be fined for covering her face with a burqa, but equally fined if she doesn't cover her face with a face mask. So again, we've got paradoxical impulses about the importance of covering the face, and interesting, it's about motive and how it's covered. So there's interesting things there. We're also seeing how attitudes to face masks have changed over time. So initially, we have this is an example of an American Twitter feed, someone broadly on the right, who in the early phase of Twitter actually put a mask-wearing icon on her emoji on her Twitter handle, but as it became increasingly politicized, she starts talking about not importance of not wearing masks, even while still having that mask wearing emoji in her Twitter handle. So we can see that there's often contradictory impulses, even within individuals and certainly within systems, about faces and how they're covered and how they're not covered. What's also particularly interesting is the intersection between wearing masks and gender roles. Men are more likely to catch COVID. Men are more likely to suffer serious long-term health impacts from COVID. Men are more likely to die from COVID. But equally, men are less likely to wear facial coverings. And this is a really interesting debate, which I think needs exploring more about the relationship between things like covering the face and senses of masculinity. The idea that covering the face is something which is seen as effeminate, it's a way of ceding control over the body, it's seen as something which is making an individual into a victim, making them into something passive, which keys into a lot of contemporary representations of masculinity we find within certain streams of contemporary society, and particularly aligned with certain political positions. I want to come to the end now, and I want to start thinking finally about the mask in terms of its material trajectory. And we've already talked in previous lectures about this idea of object biography or object narrative. And I think it's important to remember that masks have a life cycle, particularly the disposable mask. So for many of us, we'll all have noticed how many masks we see just dropped around, littering our streets and landscapes. Now, what's interesting is I think over the last 8 months, I've noticed a series of phases of what we might call deposition of this kind of rubbish. When the lockdown started, we saw face masks and disposable rubber gloves being dropped in the streets. Then, as people stopped wearing rubber gloves, we started just seeing face masks being disposed in the streets. Now, as more and more people are wearing permanent or semi-permanent face masks, and less people are using temporary paper face masks, we're seeing far fewer of the paper face masks being dropped. Nonetheless, they are causing a major issue of pollution, particularly in maritime contexts. And again, there's all the issues of microplastics and microfibers getting into the wider environment. So we see the face mask and as a proxy for COVID, actually potentially forming a clear stratigraphic spike within our depositional practice over the last year. But also it's interesting how we're seeing face masks being disposed of in other ways. This is a rag tree in County Westmeath in Ireland. Rag trees are a traditional practice in many areas, which have been partly co-opted by the New Age movement, where people will tie rags or bits of fabric onto trees which are seen as holy or sacred, as a practice bringing good luck or hope for the future. There's always been quite a wide diversity of things which have been tied to the rag trees, but now as we move into 2020, we're seeing things like face masks and stuff being deposited onto rag trees. So we're seeing the face mask again being brought into a tradition which has got a practice which has got a very long tradition, but it's seeing contemporary new iterations. And finally, we're seeing face masks being turned into heritage already. Broadly speaking, museums at the moment, over the recent years, have become much more proactive in reacting to contemporary contingencies and contemporary political events, and starting to collect the contemporary in a way that didn't really happen before. So we're starting to see museums on an international scale collecting COVID. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing objects which we barely thought about 12 months ago now being seen and framed as heritage or potential future heritage. And of course, this keys into the idea of heritage as being a future rather than the past-oriented activity. But we're seeing how these things are becoming framed in a heritage or in a museum narrative. So what I've tried to do in this lecture is look at all the different ways in which masks have been interacted with, or the messages they've sent over recent years. Of course, mask wearing has a health function. It has a simple prophylactic function, but also masks have become, and they always have been, about having had an element of identity making, and keyed into patterns of consumption. Also, masks have unsurprisingly got a real social and political valency. They can be used in lots of different ways. Even the most simple, functional fibre, plastic, paper mask inevitably has become freighted with social and political messages. And finally, we need to think about these objects as things which have lives and trajectories, and particularly as we're moving into the next stage of COVID, think about the trajectories of disposal of masks in a little bit more detail. So I'll leave it there. We'll be talking more about mask wearing and masks in our live session next week.